Welcome to Occult Archives, the show where we uncover the mysteries, myths, and legends behind some of history's most feared books.
And today we're diving deep into Franz Hartmann's With the Adepts, an adventure among the Rosicrucians.
A journey beyond the veil of reality.
Published in 1887, this book, it claims to be a true account of the narrator's encounters with a secret society.
The Rosicrucians.
And for this deep dive, you, our listener, have provided us with excerpts from the text itself.
We're going to be looking at these accounts of the narrator meeting with these adepts, as they're called.
Their teachings.
Their abilities and
their philosophy. So today our mission is to try and distill some of the core ideas presented in Hartmann's narrative.
Yeah.
What exactly is the nature of reality according to these adepts?
What powers do they claim to have?
What are their beliefs?
And what might this tell you, listener, about the hidden potential within yourself and the world all around you?
Well, I think a good place to start is with Hartmann's initial reflection on consciousness. He asked this very fundamental question: is our awareness simply a product of the physical body?
Or is it some function of universal life?
He describes this longing, this desire to transcend the physical and connect with something much, much larger.
Right from the beginning, he talks about these examples of people, somnambules, and people in ecstatic states who seem to be able to visit distant places with their, as he calls it, inner spiritual self, while their physical bodies remain stationary.
Interesting. So right away, he's introducing this idea that maybe our awareness is not as tied to our physical form as we typically believe.
And he goes on to explore this concept throughout the book.
This idea that life and soul are not exclusive to what we normally think of as living beings.
He suggests that even what we perceive as dead matter, even that possesses a kind of life, a soul of its own. He even connects ideas like cohesion and gravitation to this concept, viewing them not simply as just forces, but expressions of energy or soul.
So are you saying that he's suggesting that there is no real distinction between what we think of as animate and inanimate?
That's exactly what he's saying.
That everything on some level possesses this kind of inner vitality.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And he even suggests that there could be these soul beings with less gross forms that we can't perceive with our normal senses.
But maybe with our soul.
Like their soul.
This really expands our understanding of what might actually populate reality.
Absolutely.
Beyond just the merely physical.
And to further expand our understanding, he really emphasizes the importance of solitude and focused thought.
He talks about how withdrawing from what he calls the superficiality and shallowness of common life is necessary in order to gain a deeper understanding of nature and also of our own selves.
For our listeners, I think what he's really getting at is that profound understanding often comes not from external stimulation,
but from inner reflection.
Exactly.
This idea of going inward to find truth is a theme we see over and over again in different mystical and philosophical traditions.
So we have this exploration of consciousness, the interconnectedness of all things, and the importance of inner reflection.
And then we shift to the narrator's actual encounter with an adept.
In a remote mountain location.
Yeah, and right away there's this weird thing with a Cretan who disappears as soon as the adept approaches.
It's like this fleeting image, but it adds to this whole mysterious atmosphere of this meeting.
I mean, it adds to the mystery, and it's also kind of creepy.
Yeah, it is.
And then the adept himself appears.
With a noble and imposing appearance.
And immediately the adept shows that he can read the narrator's thoughts.
This shows right away that this adept, this being, is operating on a completely different level than we are.
And then he tells the narrator that they've actually met before in the narrator's sleep.
So the narrator has been interacting with these adepts all along, just unconsciously.
This really makes you wonder how much is going on that we're not even aware of.
Exactly.
And then the imperator, who's like the leader of the Rosicrucian society,
explains that the memory of our physical brain is actually different from the memory of our spirit or soul.
So the narrator might not physically remember these nighttime meetings.
But his spiritual self was there.
Fascinating.
And then the imperator explains why the narrator can't just stay in this elevated environment.
Now, you would think that this pure spiritual atmosphere would be totally beneficial, right? But the imperator says that the narrator still has too many of these lower and animal elements within him, and they would be harmed by this atmosphere.
Too pure for him.
He also says the narrator still has duties to fulfill in the normal world.
Unfinished business.
So the narrator is not ready.
Not yet.
And spiritual progress is this gradual journey.
It's not like flipping a switch.
You can't just jump right to the highest level.
It takes time.
So following this encounter, the narrator, understandably, is really curious about the Adepts' spiritual powers.
Specifically, their ability to transform things and transmute metals.
The classic alchemist pursuit of turning lead into gold.
And what's really interesting is how the Imperator responds to this.
He downplays the whole miraculous aspect of it.
He says that these phenomena are no more wondrous than the everyday occurrences that we see in nature.
It's all about the power the spirit possesses to subjugate matter by means of the soul.
So it's not magic in the way we normally think about it.
It's more like a deep understanding of natural laws and how to use them.
And the Imperator says that the fundamental force behind all creation is the will.
Not just individual willpower.
But this primordial power that underlies all of existence.
Everything.
And he explains that it's not about strengthening our personal will,
but using our reason and intelligence to guide this universal willpower that's already present in nature.
He uses this really great analogy of a miller who uses the current of the river to power his mill.
Right. He's not creating the water or forcing it uphill. He's just directing this existing force in a smart way to get what he wants.
Working with nature, not against it.
And to demonstrate this, the adept even manipulates a cloud right in front of the narrator,
making it swirl and dissipate.
And then reform.
And he says that he's doing this by guiding the universal forces of nature with intelligence.
Pretty amazing demonstration.
It really shows their mastery over these forces.
Now the conversation then turns to the Rosicrucian order itself. And the narrator kind of assumes that it's a Christian organization.
Which is what a lot of people think.
Right.
And the Imperator corrects him.
He actually says that the term Rosicrucian order, as this specific organized group, that's actually a relatively modern idea.
Really?
And he attributes it largely to Johann Valentin Andreae.
Wow, yeah.
And he even suggests that Andrea's famous work, Fama Fraternitatis, which many consider to be like the foundational Rosicrucian text,
right,
was actually intended as satire.
Wow.
So the commonly accepted origin story of the Rosicrucian order might not be totally accurate.
That's interesting.
And he explains that before Andreae, the term Rosicrucian had a more general meaning.
What do you mean?
Well, it was used to describe occultists, alchemists, basically anyone who had attained a certain level of esoteric knowledge.
I see.
And they were familiar with the symbolism of the rose and the cross.
And those symbols, of course, predate Christianity.
Exactly. They're not originally Christian.
So the symbolism we associate with a specific group can have much deeper roots.
Universal roots.
And the Imperator really criticizes Christians who just worship the external forms of these symbols without understanding the real meaning behind them.
Is the difference between surface-level observation and genuine understanding.
One of the big takeaways, I think, from this is that the Adepts order, it's not based on religious dogma or belief.
It's not about blindly following a creed.
You have to possess real knowledge.
Self-realized knowledge.
They really emphasize that true knowledge is not something you just learn from someone else or from a book.
It comes from an inner realization.
It's from feeling the truth of a thing.
Understanding it with both your intellect and your intuition.
So this inner knowing is central to their whole philosophy.
And because they place so much emphasis on direct spiritual perception, they don't care about creeds or opinions.
Because if you had perfect spiritual perception, you wouldn't even need external aids like books or logic.
Oh.
But of course, they do have a library.
They do.
And the narrator asks about it.
And the Imperator says they still use books, and they study the thoughts of different thinkers, like Buddha.
But they don't accept anything as the absolute truth unless it's confirmed by their own reason and understanding.
They use these resources as tools.
Not as unquestionable authorities.
It's a very balanced approach, I think.
It is, and speaking of their library, it's full of rare books.
Even books that are thought to be lost.
And the Imperator gives a really interesting explanation for how they acquire these books.
He says every event, every thought, every book ever created leaves an imperishable impression on what he calls the astral light.
Sort of like a cosmic internet where all information is stored and accessible.
If you know how to access it.
And this means that nothing is ever truly lost.
The universe remembers everything.
And so solitude, this state of being that allows you to access these deeper levels, it's not empty or inactive.
Because ideas are real things.
And they can be accessed.
It makes you think about all the knowledge that might be out there just waiting to be discovered.
The monastery itself was founded by people who wanted to create the ideal conditions for developing this germ of divinity within.
They even use these elementary forces of nature to create illusions, to protect themselves from unwanted visitors.
So it's not just physical isolation.
It's like psychic shielding.
And despite their seclusion, they're not completely cut off from the outside world.
They have clairvoyant and clairaudient abilities.
So their perception goes way beyond what we normally experience.
And they can even interact with the world through their astral bodies. They can influence thinkers by planting useful thoughts.
That's a powerful idea.
It is. It makes you wonder what subtle influences are shaping our own thoughts.
Which brings us to the narrator's next question. If they have this ability to influence events, why haven't they intervened to prevent some of history's greatest evils and injustices?
Why didn't they stop Nero or the Inquisition?
Tough questions.
And the Adepts' answer is based on this law of justice and the idea that certain evils are actually necessary for humanity to evolve.
Necessary evil.
He compares it to a surgeon having to inflict pain to remove a cancerous growth.
It's hard to wrap your head around this idea that suffering might serve a purpose.
But he's saying that it's all part of a much bigger picture.
A plan we can't fully comprehend.
But they do say that they're not allowed to interfere with individual freedom.
Or the creation of karma.
Each person has to create their own destiny.
And face the consequences of their actions.
It all comes back to individual responsibility.
And the unfolding of natural consequences.
So they can't just step in and prevent suffering.
Because that would violate this fundamental law.
But they do say that all experiences, even suffering, ultimately serve a purpose.
And that those who endure hardship for a greater cause will be rewarded in the end.
There's a great line that sums this up. It says that an adept cannot be made, but that he must grow to become one.
So it's all about inner development.
Not about someone just giving you power.
You have to earn it.
Which leads to the narrator's suggestion that others could create similar secluded places for spiritual growth.
These havens for like-minded seekers.
But the adept brings us back to the importance of real knowledge.
Not just good intentions.
He says that societies built only on shared beliefs and opinions are likely to fall apart.
Because everyone has their own individual view.
Real harmony requires a deeper experiential understanding.
Not just intellectual agreement.
And that brings us to what the text calls unexpected revelations, where the adept starts to answer the narrator's deeper questions.
About nature, humanity, and existence.
Some of the most profound and maybe even disturbing ideas in the book.
The adept says that mortal humans are basically intellectual animals living a sort of dream life.
Mistaking illusion for reality.
But that the real man is this celestial being.
A soul living in a material body.
So there's this distinction between what we perceive as reality.
And a deeper truth.
And he says that within our physical body, there's a spiritual divine spark that's always developing the immortal part of ourselves.
He even references St. Paul's idea of being sown in corruption and raised in incorruption.
And that this spiritual man is each person's own personal God and Redeemer.
Wow, so we all have this potential for divinity within us.
But until we become aware of the processes going on within our soul, we don't have much control over our own growth.
We're like a plant that's at the mercy of the elements.
But with self-knowledge, with awareness of our soul's working,
we can start to direct our own development.
And the adept says that the ultimate goal is for the soul to realize that herself is everything.
That there's nothing beyond it.
That the purpose of life is for mortal man to become immortal.
And to become a perfect instrument for divine wisdom.
It's a huge idea.
Yes, it suggests a destiny that we can barely even imagine.
And to really drive this point home, the adept does this demonstration where he has the narrator project his consciousness out of his body.
And the narrator sees his own physical body lying there, lifeless.
It must have been a shocking experience.
To see yourself as an empty shell.
It really shows that our true self is not limited to the physical form.
And that the divine soul has many ways of acting in the world.
And of course, the narrator wants to know why science doesn't acknowledge any of this.
And the adept says it's because of scientists' self-conceit.
They don't want to admit that they might not know everything.
And he contrasts this with the theories of theologians, which he also finds unsatisfactory.
Because they present this simplistic view of humanity's final state.
And divine judgment.
He talks about how books like The Secret Doctrine are challenging these traditional scientific and theological views.
Reviving the ancient understanding of humanity's continuous evolution.
It's a critique of both science that ignores the inner world.
And dogma that limits inquiry.
He says that science only understands the outer shell of a human being.
It doesn't see the living power within.
And he reiterates that justice is inherent in the divine.
And that salvation is tied to our spiritual evolution.
It's not something that's just handed to us.
We can't just jump to a higher state after death without doing the work in this life.
He talks about the theosophical view of humanity,
which was known to the ancient Indian sages and Paracelsus.
And Blavatsky.
He says that this view should humble both scientists and priests.
Because it shows that humans aren't already divine.
But we have the potential for divinity.
And that the laws that govern physical growth,
they have parallels on the psychical plane.
And that growth, whether physical or spiritual, requires the right conditions.
Which brings us to the necessity of resistance.
The narrator, maybe wanting an easier path,
expresses his desire for a comfortable Rosicrucian convent.
A nice, peaceful retreat.
But the master uses this powerful analogy to explain why that's not the way.
The analogy of the pine forest?
The trees that only have branches at the top, they're easily knocked over by storms because they don't have strong roots.
But the isolated pines that are exposed to the elements, they have to develop strong roots and branches.
They're resilient.
So challenges are essential for developing strength.
Inner strength.
You can't just avoid hardship.
You have to face it.
And he criticizes those people who withdraw from the world out of fear.
Trying to get an easy ticket to heaven without actually doing the work.
He sees that as avoidance.
A true renunciation.
He says that there's no point in living a harmless but useless life.
Just waiting for a reward in the next life.
He compares it to a sensualist who just seeks pleasure in this life.
Or a bigot who's hoping for pleasure in the next life.
Both are motivated by selfishness.
And he contrasts this with the spiritually developed individual whose divine spark is self-existent.
It doesn't depend on external conditions.
True asceticism is not about escaping the world.
It's about conquering your lower self while living in the midst of temptations.
That's real strength.
And this inspires the adept to talk about his vision of an ideal theosophical academy.
Centers of learning where intellectual and spiritual development go hand in hand.
Teaching a new science based on universal laws and self-mastery.
He believes that this would be the greatest gift to the world.
It would create real progress.
And lead to amazing breakthroughs.
But he also says that the biggest obstacle is not a lack of resources,
but a lack of the right people.
He says that gold is actually a curse.
It just creates more desire.
What we really need are people who genuinely want wisdom.
Not knowledge for personal gain.
Or just out of curiosity.
He then describes this ideal theosophical monastery.
But it exists far beyond Earth.
It's a state of pure consciousness where everyone is united with the universal soul.
Free from limitations.
Free from desire.
Even free from death.
Sounds pretty amazing.
It does, but unfortunately we're stuck here for now.
And the adept laments that our civilization forces us to focus on external things.
We spend all our energy outwards.
Which leaves very little for inward growth.
For nourishing that divine spark, he challenges us to think about what we consider to be necessities.
He says that a lot of things we think we need are actually artificial creations.
He points out that people lived full lives long before we had all these modern conveniences.
Necessity is relative.
Think about it. What do you really need to live a good life?
And by letting go of these artificial needs,
we can free up a lot of energy
to pursue what's truly eternal.
Which brings us to his critique of people who only focus on external science.
While neglecting self-knowledge.
He compares it to an insect that's studying a fallen leaf.
Thinking that it's understanding the whole tree.
Without knowing the fundamental laws that govern its growth.
It's missing the bigger picture.
He says that knowing yourself is more important than investigating external things.
It's the foundation for all true understanding.
Which leads the narrator to ask about God.
How can you prove that God exists?
And the adept's response is filled with sorrow.
He feels sad for those who can't see God's presence in everything.
He says that the Supreme Spirit is beyond our ability to comprehend.
Our intellect is too limited to grasp the infinite.
He says that nothing is real but God.
And that nature is just a manifestation of God's power.
And he concludes by saying that we each have to become a living witness of God's presence.
By cultivating those divine qualities within ourselves.
So it's not about worshiping an external God.
It's about realizing the divine within.
And as they're having this discussion, they hear the sound of silver bells ringing,
signaling the assembly in the refectory.
And as they enter the garden, the narrator is amazed by how beautiful it is.
It's so lush and vibrant.
Filled with flowers and plants.
And the narrator points out that this seems to contradict the adept's earlier comments about sensual gratification.
Yeah, how can they enjoy these beautiful surroundings if they're supposed to be renouncing those things?
And the Imperator explains that this garden is actually an illusion.
An illusion.
Created to make the narrator's visit more enjoyable.
Wow.
He picks a rose to show the narrator that it's real, but also an illusion.
It's not the narrator's illusion,
But a product of nature's imagination.
guided by the adept's will.
This leads to a discussion about the nature of reality itself.
The adept says that the entire world is a product of the imagination of the universal mind.
What he calls the akasa, this primordial substance that everything is made of.
So forms are not inherently real,
They're just temporary shapes.
like clay being molded,
The adept's will can create shapes in this universal mind.
and through a process he calls the motion of will, these shapes can become dense and visible.
So thought can literally create matter.
And this leads the narrator to ask how an image in someone's head can become real.
And the adept kind of laughs at the narrator's limited understanding of the mind.
He says that the mind is not just inside our head.
It extends as far as our perception can reach.
It comes into contact with everything,
And the brain is just a receiver of messages from the mind.
not the mind itself.
Think of the mind like a field of awareness that goes beyond your physical body,
To demonstrate this, the adept makes a magnolia tree disappear.
showing that it existed in his mind, just as it did in the narrator's,
And he says that we all live inside each other's spheres of mind.
which is a pretty profound thought.
It is. It suggests this deep connection between all beings,
And he says that consciousness has the potential to expand.
to become one with the universe.
He calls it a paradise of consciousness.
And this leads to a discussion about the power of imagination
He says the humans underestimate the power of imagination.
and the importance of our thoughts.
He says that every thought we have creates a corresponding form or power in our mind,
And that these thought forms can become so dense,
that they can become living entities
even persisting after our death.
and drawn back to us.
It's like we're constantly creating our own reality with our thoughts.
But the narrator wants to know if every evil thought automatically creates a being of evil.
And the Imperator explains that it's not that simple,
Thoughts need to be infused with will to become truly powerful,
specifically spiritual will,
coming from the heart.
not just from the intellect.
It's our desires that give power to our thoughts.
And luckily, very few people have the power to actually materialize their thoughts,
Which is probably a good thing.
considering how many negative thoughts people have,
He says that it's important to develop virtue,
before trying to acquire spiritual powers.
because these things used to be kept secret for a reason.
They're not for everyone.
And as they're talking, they enter a hall where the other brothers are gathered.
And to the narrator's surprise, there are 2 lady adepts there.
This is interesting because it challenges the typical image of a monastery.
And one of the lady adepts says that intelligence transcends sex.
Once you move past those basic instincts,
And then the conversation turns to the courage needed for occult research.
because you have to face the opposition of what they call the elemental world.
And the animal elements within ourselves,
These elementals live off our life force.
our energy.
And when we start to awaken our spiritual side,
It disrupts their food supply.
so they fight back.
They try to prevent us from progressing spiritually.
They live in the lower parts of the soul.
And they can even become visible sometimes.
To illustrate this, one of the lady adepts creates an illusion of a rattlesnake appearing among pears.
Pretty scary image.
It represents those inner elementals that we all have to deal with
And she emphasizes that we have to master them.
before they master us,
She says that fearless thought is destructive to them.
because they're ultimately our own creations.
This leads to a conversation about occultism and natural wisdom.
One of the brothers says that occultism and alchemy are both easy and difficult.
Depending on how you approach them,
If you use your innate wisdom,
it's easy.
but if you rely on false logic,
It becomes very difficult. He says that children are able to see images of eternal truths.
because they haven't been corrupted by prejudice,
But as our intellect develops,
we lose that clarity.
and he wonders if our education systems really teach us about the book of nature.
Or if they just teach us artificial systems.
We learn names and categories.
But we lose touch with the true essence of things,
He compares this to animals who are guided by instinct,
which he says is analogous to human reason.
the soul's ability to feel truth. He says that animals have remained natural,
While humans have become unnatural,
focusing on the external.
while neglecting our inner being,
We have to learn to use our intellect with reason.
not against it.
Intellect alone doesn't guarantee wisdom.
You can be smart and still be a fool.
And the brother emphasizes that the first step to spiritual power is becoming natural again.
Shedding all those unnatural qualities we've picked up.
Because if you try to become spiritual before becoming natural,
you could become what he calls an unnatural spiritual monster.
A black magician.
And he clarifies that most criminals are not black magicians.
They just act out of selfish desires.
Not out of a love for evil itself.
But true black magicians.
They love evil for its own sake.
Just like true adepts love good for its own sake.
And the more we repeat an action, whether it's good or evil,
the more it becomes instinctive.
And the more we identify with it.
So be careful what you choose.
Because it might become you.
At this point, the imperator has to leave.
He's got some important political matters to attend to.
Apparently, he has to stop a statesman from doing something stupid.
That could lead to war.
So even though they're secluded, they're still aware of what's going on in the world.
And they try to help in subtle ways.
He leaves the narrator in the care of Theodorus,
who the narrator recognizes as Paracelsus,
the famous alchemist and physician.
Theodorus has this remarkable skull formation.
And he's clearly a very advanced being.
He was an adept in a past life.
And he's here to show the narrator the alchemical laboratory.
And to correct some of the narrator's misconceptions about alchemy.
Theodorus explains that alchemy is not just about transmuting metals.
It's about purifying and ennobling human nature.
He uses the image of a crucible
to symbolize this process of inner transformation.
All those alchemical terms like death and putrefaction.
They refer to the breaking down of our lower nature.
So that the light of the spirit can shine through.
And he says that all those alchemical recipes and processes,
they have both literal and figurative meaning.
They apply to all of nature.
Not just to metals.
He emphasizes that nature is interconnected.
It's all one organism.
This was something that the ancient alchemists understood.
But that modern chemists have forgotten.
He quotes from the Book of Sohar.
About how everything in the material world has a spiritual counterpart.
And how the higher realms influence the lower realms.
And he brings up the old teaching that humanity is a microcosm of the macrocosm.
But he says it's not enough just to know this intellectually.
You have to experience it.
He says that the entire universe exists within us.
And that we are the creators of our own inner universe.
We populate it with our thoughts.
And give them life with our will.
It's a powerful idea.
That we have this creative power within us.
And that each of us has the potential to become any kind of being.
From a tiger to an angel.
It all depends on which elements we cultivate within ourselves.
He points to this symbol of a double interlaced triangle.
Which represents the macrocosm.
And a smaller symbol that represents the microcosm.
He says that when we harmonize these two within ourselves,
we gain control over the forces of nature.
And when the narrator starts to think about the complicated processes involved in alchemy,
all the ingredients and the mixing and the heating,
Theodorus says that the true alchemical process is actually very simple.
It's the unfolding of life itself.
The alchemist just guides and controls this life power.
To create new forms.
And to increase substance.
Unlike chemists who just rearrange existing elements.
Alchemists work with the life principle itself.
And he says that true alchemy is not just about turning lead into gold.
It's about subjecting matter to the power of life.
He talks about the red powder that's used as a catalyst to make gold grow.
And he actually shows the narrator how it works.
He takes the narrator's silver.
And transmutes it into gold.
And the narrator is amazed.
He's never seen anything like it.
And he vows to use any alchemical knowledge he gains.
Only for the good of humanity.
Because making gold is nothing compared to understanding the secrets of nature and human beings.
And Theodorus lends the narrator a book.
Called The Secret Symbols of the Rosicrucians.
He tells him to study it.
And promises to guide him invisibly.
This book is like a textbook of universal science.
It covers everything from the macrocosm and the microcosm
to time and eternity,
occult numbers, the elements, the Trinity,
regeneration, alchemy, philosophy, the Kabbalah.
Theodorus says that understanding the contents of this book leads to the philosopher's stone.
And the universal panacea.
Which essentially means immortality.
But he says that the real goal is not just about controlling life to make jewels and gold.
It's about transforming the animal nature into the human nature.
And the human nature into the divine nature.
That's the ultimate alchemy.
Transforming yourself into a god.
And he stresses that this inner transformation is more important than any material.